Hello, everybody, and welcome to the show. This is episode 142 of the Meet the Farmers podcast, and I'm your host, Ben Eagle. Today on the show, I am really pleased to say that I have broadcaster, journalist, and founder of Just Farmers, Anna Jones, with me. Anna is here to tell us all about her upcoming book, Divide, the relationship crisis between town and country, which is available in all the usual places from March the 3rd. The book is highly personal, but also adept in terms of exploring the bigger picture. Anna tells us her story of growing up on a small farm to moving to the city to follow through with her journalism career ambitions. She explores the perceived disparities between town and country, but also looks for common ground, which is always an important aspiration in my mind. For me personally, it was really interesting reading about someone who shared my own experience in my head, this urban-rural personal divide. So I have friends in town and country, and having lived for some years in Bristol, and now back on the family farm in Essex, I too really share this personal rural-urban divide in terms of understanding my own identity. So it was absolutely fascinating reading this book, and we haven't even started the interview yet. But honestly, guys, please go out, pre-order it, and if you're listening to this after March the 3rd, please order a copy as well, because it is really fascinating. As it says on the book sleeve, this book will surely start conversations, which I hope it will. Anna, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for inviting me on. Like another bucket list. Yeah, on Meet the Farmers. Wow.
Well, as you can tell, I'm probably quite excited. I'm probably more excited than you are to have you on.
I think we're both pretty excited.
I think so. I've given a brief intro, mostly to the book there, but obviously the book is a lot about you as well. But can you introduce yourself to listeners? I know that many listeners will already know of you and your work.
Well, first of all, thank you for introducing it so brilliantly and for plugging the book like that. And I'm really pleased that that it resonated with you, Ben, because that's kind of what I was aiming for. So yeah, a bit about me. My name's Anna. I grew up on a small family beef and sheep farm right on the border between England and Wales, near Oswestry in Shropshire, and went to university, studied journalism, kind of knew at a freakishly young age that that's what I wanted to be. And kind of once I do set my mind on things, I tend to be quite focused. And then I went to journalism at uni and then worked in newspapers as a reporter in general news, sort of door knocking for a few years, and then knew that I wanted to somehow bring farming into my journalism career. And that's when I sort of started banging on the door of the BBC. 2006, got a job on Country File, spent 12 years at the BBC, working on various rural affairs programs, from Country File to Farming Today to On Your Farm on Radio 4, and then went freelance. And as you've mentioned, off the back of my Nuffield scholarship, which looked at the coverage of agriculture in the media, and the relationship there that isn't always positive, I decided to set up something to try and help. And Just Farmers is my small way of trying to build bridges between an urban media and a rural farming population. And I think all of this whole experience is what's led to the book.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned there that you knew what you wanted to do from quite an early age, which not everyone has. Why do you think?
It's not a cool answer, unfortunately. It's do you remember those PSC lessons that you used to have in school? Yeah. So we had a teacher that came in and was going around the class and asking what everyone wanted to be. And I knew I wanted to be some kind of city power woman. And I had this, I think I'd watched a lot of 80s movies, and in the 80s it was all about power dressing women, and it was quite a feminist time. And as a young, impressionable, 8-9-year-old or whatever, watching these women, I was always like, I want to stride around Manhattan in heels. I want to be like that. And so I always thought I was going to be a lawyer, because that's the ultimate striding around in heels job. And then that PSC lesson, I remember one of the girls in my class said that she wanted to be a journalist. And it was the first time I'd ever heard that word journalist out loud. But I remember thinking, oh my God, that's me. Like,
Yeah.
I love talking. I love asking questions. I'm very, very nosy, and I love writing. And I remember I nicked the idea off a girl in class. Like, that's so not cool, is it? But that is the truth.
That's brilliant. And then fast forward several years, and yeah, like I say, you've outlined your career so far in that, and so many highlights in that. But I mean, why do you think you struggled to reconcile that direction that you've been so determined to go down with your rural upbringing?
So my rural upbringing was something that I really took for granted when I was a child, and I think that was for lots of reasons. One, at that time, 1990s, farming was having a very, very difficult time, and Dad did not encourage any of us, me nor my two sisters, to go into farming. In fact, he actively discouraged it.
Yep.
And he wanted us to explore the world. He wanted us to get an education, like get educated. He used to say that all the time.
Yep.
Go and do something else. And Mum was very adventurous as well, and was all about kind of go out there and have adventures. And the school that I was in never encouraged agriculture either, or really, it really never acknowledged that we were rural kids growing up in an agricultural community. It kind of wanted to push you away from it. If you showed any kind of academic ability, I remember that subtle pressure from the teachers of, you go to university, you go. So I think there was that kind of pushed me away from my rural life. And then I eventually ended up, I was quite old when I moved to a city for the first time. I was 25 when I moved to Birmingham. And because Preston, where I went to uni, wasn't a city when I was in uni, it was still a town.
Yeah.
And so 25, ended up in Birmingham, and I just had the best time.
Yeah.
For a couple of years, I kind of forgot home, really.
Okay.
I really threw myself into it. And the only time I ever really went to the countryside was when I went to music festivals. And, so I really, really embraced urban life. And I didn't realize that I was changing. And I think very, very subtly changing. And I felt when I went home that a sort of formality had sprung up between people that I had known all my life, like in my community. Like, we used to talk so freely, we'd pass each other on the road and wind the window down on the lane and have a good old chin wag. But suddenly people were more formal around me, or less familiar. And I suddenly realized, I was like, my God, I'm not part of this community anymore. People are different around me. People think that I'm different. And you know what? I probably am different. And, I'd stopped going to Young Farmers. I stopped going to the Royal Welsh Show, socializing with young country people. I wasn't doing it as much as I used to. And it was like a door had clicked shut behind me. And I started to feel like I was losing a part of myself. And I know that might sound dramatic, but I'm sure there must be other people that have felt that. And because you do change moving to a city. And not just that, the people in your community, in your farming community, look at you differently because you've moved to the city.
Yeah.
And I had this conversation with Matt Naylor, flower grower from Lincolnshire, and he was saying, it's true. You see these people that go off and have their life in the city, and they come back, and the community does look at them differently. They don't quite fit in the same way anymore. And that was a great sadness to me, probably more than a sadness. It was kind of an anxiety and a panic. And that's one of the reasons I went for my Nuffield scholarship and applied, because I was trying to get something back that I felt like I was in danger of losing. So that's why I did struggle, as you say, to sort of reconcile those two identities. I think that was the beginning of that struggle, was that recognition that I was changing.
Yeah, I mean, so much of that resonates with me. And both, especially at school, and also growing up on, we were a dairy farm in the 90s, end of the MMB, and it was a terrible time on the farm, and so much so that me and my sister back then, we were definitely got the feeling. I don't think we were ever came up as a conversation, but I felt massively discouraged, definitely, from both going into the family business, but also just agriculture generally. I don't think it even featured as even a prospect. It was always go and do something else, make something else with your life. And And then similarly, how you were saying when you moved to Birmingham, I know when I moved to Bristol, I actually moved up to Norfolk straight after school, but then after a few years, eventually went to uni in Bristol and then stayed after as well for a bit. And definitely for that first sort of few years, I completely get that as well. You don't even think, but it was strangely, strangely for me, it was actually moving away that then reattracted me to that rural heritage, and it was that actually got me back out onto farms. I started doing lots of volunteering with conservation, then I ended up going into conservation as well for a time. But it's fascinating how when you experience both sides, and this is what one of the things I love about the book, it actually makes you think about that, which we don't really think about generally. It makes you think about both those sides. Anyway, I'm rambling. Let's go back to you.
No, I love hearing it because you're right. People don't talk about it. It has been overlooked and it's never consciously acknowledged, which I think is a mistake. And that's why I love talking about it and hearing your experiences, Ben, because it's kind of been, when it's reflected back at you from other people's experiences, you think, oh God, this isn't just me. This is a thing. This is a cultural difference that actually it's important to acknowledge it, and it's important to acknowledge that there are different identities that go with being an urban person or a rural person. So no, I'm fascinated to hear your experiences.
So you explore your family history in the opening chapter, and a lot of the book is highly personal. In a latter chapter, for example, you write about your pregnancy, for example. Why was it important for you to make this a personal book, and I suppose why did you want to write it in the first place? And I know it's horrible when interviewers do this, but one further question on that was why now? I suppose is an important question as well.
Why is it so personal? And it's important to write about what you know, and because otherwise, and what you feel, because the issues in the book are deeply, deeply personal to me. And I wasn't sure that I could really show the divide unless I showed how it had affected me.
Okay.
And I suppose by opening myself up, I hope that the book will encourage people to open themselves up as well, and to maybe have a little look inside and think, oh, have I experienced some of these uncomfortable feelings? Like you said, it resonated with you. And I write about, I think I was writing the book when I got pregnant and also lost the baby, and all of that happened while I was writing the book.
Oh wow.
And so it was almost, I was writing in real time. And it was such a huge thing in my life. And as you read in the book, it kind of led me to meet people who had hugely relevant things to say about this. It was all sort of tied up. And I also wrote it in lockdown. So when you're kind of, I had a miscarriage in that January 2021 hard lockdown, totally cut off from my family and friends.
Gosh, Anna.
Like, it was very, very difficult. And all I really had to pour myself into was the book. But that's not, I don't feel bad about that. And that's certainly not negative. I think in some ways it was cathartic to be able to share that. But ultimately it is about write what you know. And that's always been drilled into me all through my career is, write what you know about, write what you're passionate about, and that will translate, and other people will hopefully be infected by that enthusiasm and enjoy reading it.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope they will too. I'm sure they will. I mean, there is loads packed into it, and I don't want to give too many spoilers away, but I imagine there was, in fact, I know there was a lot that didn't make the cut, which is always the bit that interests me, and I don't know how much your publishers will allow you to say, but I mean, what were some of those things that you wrote about that didn't make it through?
I was asked to write a 60,000 word book. Guess how many words I submitted?
I'm guessing almost double, probably, being you.
107,000 words. See, too much time
editor's
on my hands.
nightmare.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I know when they gave me the contract and it said 60,000 words, I remember thinking, oh my God, I'm never going to be able to write that much. But as soon as I started writing, it all just came spilling out. So rather than salami slicing through the whole book, one of the things that the publisher decided to do was take out a whole chapter. They just took out a whole chapter, which was called Culture. There was a culture chapter in there.
Right.
And the culture chapter looked at fashion, country clothing and streetwear. It talked about how we converse. It talked about the culture of the livestock markets. It talked a lot about country sports, actually. There was a lot on shooting and hunting and things in that chapter. And in the end, it was a difficult decision, but I think they thought, some of the other chapters are really quite, we've got politics, we've got environment, we've got food, these are big, big issues. And they're like, it felt a little trite compared to everything else. It was it was a little bit of a more light-hearted chapter. And I'm going to take some of it and put it into blogs because I wouldn't want that work to be wasted. But, Matt Naylor, who I've spoken about, the flower grower in Lincolnshire and the co-founder of AgRespect, he featured heavily in the culture chapter. And he's such a witty guy. And he is. One of the things we were talking about, clothes that farmers wear. And I was sad that this didn't make it into the book, actually. And he said to me, he was like, why do farmers have to wear somber looking clothes? And he was like, you go to the livestock markets and it's a sea of kind of muted green.
That's such a Matt thing to say. Yeah.
Like they dress the colour of a hedgerow in winter. And it was just like, yes, they do. And it's like, why? And then he said to me, he's like, can you imagine if you turned up at the auction wearing a ski jacket like John Craven, like a bright red ski jacket? And he was like, people would look at you because you should wear a somber looking coat. We're farmers. And so anyway, I talked, it was those kind of conversations that didn't make it into the final cut.
Yeah. Okay. And the final title, of course, Divide. I suppose why that title, and were there any alternative titles, and what conclusion did you come to?
I suppose a more accurate name for the book would probably be Difference.
Yeah.
Which is, but that doesn't sound very interesting.
It's not as good a title, is it?
It doesn't sound very interesting. It doesn't really make grammatical sense either. It's just people are like, what the hell? But really, the only reason there is a divide is because we don't consciously acknowledge and respect the difference. If we just accepted the differences, there wouldn't be a divide. And Divide, no, that was the first title that came up. And then that was it. There was the tagline was going to be different, and I'm really glad they changed it because it was a bit crap looking back. It was originally when I pitched the book, it was called Divide, and then it said how the town mouse and the country mouse went to war.
Okay.
But they've changed it to the relationship crisis between town and country, which is a billion times better. And I wish I'd thought of that myself. So no, but it was always going to be called Divide.
Okay. I mean, you write quite often in the book the way you feel when you're in different social environments, and we spoke about this very briefly before we started recording. And you often end up, and I find this as well, you often end up taking the side of urban when in rural setting and rural when in an urban setting around different people. I mean, what's your experience of that? How do you find that?
Difficult, lonely, upsetting, and definitely isolating, because it wears on you after a while when you're constantly playing devil's advocate. We live in an age where so many people have such clear, defined ideas in debates, and they choose a side and they stick to it, and they're so resolute in their belief. And I don't know what that feels like. I've never been resolute in my ideas around these debates, and I think that's partly because I'm a journalist, and it is my job to kind of listen and explore and question all different angles. Secondly, I'm BBC trained, and whatever you think about the BBC, I think it's bonkers that people think the BBC is biased, because you are just any opinions are just like hammered out of you. Like, you are not allowed opinions on anything, you know. So impartiality has been kind of like absolutely drilled into me at the BBC, but also because I do live in these two worlds. You've got one foot in both camps, and how can you set yourself on an extreme end of a spectrum when you've got all of these different influences around you and all these different opinions? So I think before I wrote the book, in the years before I wrote it, I was getting really down about it, because I was like, I am fed up of never belonging to a tribe. I'm fed up of always feeling on the outside, always being the bad guy, always losing, and just getting it in the neck. You know, dinner parties, you're just like Mrs. Unpopular, and then you go to something else in the countryside and you're Mrs. Unpopular there as well, and you're just kind of like, what? And that, now having written the book, I think it's kind of made me feel a little bit more confident in that now. So I'm like, actually, it's all right to be on the outside and to never feel like you truly belong to the tribe. That is okay. Like, you don't have to be, you know, agreeing with everyone all the time. And so now I feel a little bit more empowered about that and not so down about it. But ultimately, we're humans and we want to belong, don't we? We want to fit in. And sometimes if you're a bit of an urban rural half breed like I am, you don't always fit in.
Yeah, I mean, there's a brilliant section of the book in that politics section where, because I one of the things I love is the way that you describe those experiences of the interview process that you have with people, and the way that you meet people. There's a particular couple in Bristol who you meet, and I love that conversation. I'm not going to get going too much because, again, read the book, guys. So in the politics section, you write in there of a sort of window of opportunity we seem to have at the moment in terms of bringing people together in the countryside in some sort of shared project of tackling the various crises we have. And I know there are strong views on this work, but and there's also dichotomous views as well. We've got food security, we've got tackling the nature and climate crisis. I mean, you speak to a lot of different people in lots of different settings. What's your sense on sort of feeling of unity? And also, there's been such a profound shift. I remember on the day after Brexit Day, I was still living in Bristol then, and I remember walking down Park Street, actually, just the sort of shock and disbelief, but also going out to a lot of farmers and speaking to people in sort of rural settings as well that time. And I suppose the Scotland debate as well, if we're going back a few years before then as well, we had Brexit, the whole European debate. And now, obviously, we've got the Ukraine crisis, which we'll see how that shifts as well. But I suppose this is a very long way of saying that. What is your personal feeling as someone who speaks to a lot of different people in different settings on that question of unity? Where are we right now?
I'm an eternal optimist, which gets me into trouble sometimes because I always like to see the bright side. I'm definitely a glass half full person. And usually that's a good thing, but sometimes it can mean that the way I read things is slightly off. So we had a couple of mates round for dinner last night, and I knew this question was going to come up. So I thought, I'll just float it with my mates, because I was going to say, I think that we are entering into more unified thinking, and I'll explain why in a moment. But I asked my two friends about it, and they were just like, no, not in any way. They're like, it's like more divided than ever. And they were like, politics is going to get even more divisive. And I was like, oh, right, okay. So I asked them why. And my friend Vicky made a really interesting point. And she was like, she goes, it doesn't matter if politics is divisive or not. The way that we now commentate on politics is so divisive because of social media that it will keep public conversation in a divisive place because of the way social media works and the way the algorithms work, and the way that it kind of plays to the less nice aspects of our human nature, you know, these sort of this echo chamber thinking and so on. So I was a bit bummed out by that. I was like, oh, right, okay. Because what I was going to say was what I found while I was writing the book was that, yes, when you look at belief systems, and when you look at groups, and when you look at ideologies, has the world ever been less divided? We are in a bit of a polarized place. But when you talk to the individuals, and as you said there, I do talk to a lot of different people in the book, it kind of melts away and it's not there anymore. And you think, people on an individual basis are so much more understanding, accepting, compassionate, empathetic, and willing to engage. I never met anyone who I felt summed up, the kind of, I don't want to listen to anyone who doesn't think like me. I actually haven't. Have you met a person like that?
Yes.
Have you? Maybe all the people I'm talking to are too nice.
I've met some people like that, but they're definitely in the minority.
Yes, I have met people like that as well, but you're right. They are in the minority. They're not most people, but sometimes when we read newspapers or we look at social media, it can give you the impression that most people are like that, which they're not. So I would say, very long way of saying it is, I hope that there is potential for us to be entering a more unified age, because it is possible. I actually remember starting university and one of my journalism lecturers saying to me, and this was in the early noughties, we are living in an age of consensus politics. And I always remember that. And I was like, God, how boring. How boring to be at university.
Yep.
I'm supposed to be like marching against things and picketing and just having opinions, and there were, it's a consensus age of politics. And I remember, but how I yearn for that now, how I am nostalgic for that, and I want that back. So yeah, I would say to 18-year-old me, careful what you wish for. You've got it pretty damn good. So it's obviously possible to have that more unified, less divisive way of running the country and being as people. I hope it comes back.
Okay. What about food? And you write extensively in the book about food experiences. And I'm actually provide one quote. We're going to get one quote of the book here. Where are we? Okay, farming and the countryside feel very far away. This is speaking of an area of Bristol that you're in. Yet food culture in this deeply urban area is flourishing. There's a Whole Food deli and artisan bakery just a 2-minute walk up the street. I can explore the cuisines of India, Poland, Somalia, China, Thailand, Italy, Latin America, and the Caribbean, all within a square mile of my house. And then you later write the reaction that your parents had to a butternut squash you left for them, which I loved. You also write of the reasons why people in different environments might choose to eat what they eat. Why do you think it's important that we talk about those questions in the context of an urban-rural divide? Why is food so important still, or is it so important still?
Yeah, so the butternut squash, or that bloody-eyed orange thing, as my dad calls it.
Brilliant.
So yeah, I kind of, in that chapter, I do call out this trend for saying food and farming, and putting them together as this one entity. And I know that the NFU do it because I think they think, well, people don't care about farming, but they care about food. Yep. So if we package our issues and the things that we want the public to get on board with, if we package it as food and farming together, that'll help people get on board because they can relate to the food bit. And I actually think it's a mistake to just shove the two together and assume that people are going to get it, that they are one, that they are entwined. And that works both in an urban setting and a rural setting. So in an urban setting, food flourishing, yeah, absolutely. And I write about my partner, Alex, who spends a lot of money on food. He is a foodie. Yeah. He will put foodie as part of his identity. But he didn't give a crap about farming before we met. Absolutely never thought about it. It literally, and I'm not exact, it literally never crossed his mind how the food that he adores so much was produced, where it was raised, what country it was from. He's never looked at a label of meat. He doesn't know what the red tractor is, and he's never asked where food comes from in a restaurant. So, and he's not unique. That goes for most of my friends in the city. But then bring it to the countryside, and the farmers that I know in my family and in my circles, a lot of them, they love talking about commodities. They love talking about farming, and they love talking about livestock. Yep. But baking and cooking and menus and recipes, no.
Yeah.
Like,
this is George Young's vendetta, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And he's in the book, and I give him a
Yeah.
great platform to get that out there, and I share it. I do. And a connection to farming does not automatically mean that you are connected to food. You might not really give a jot about food, but be a farmer. So from those two things, I'm like, beware the danger of packaging food and farming together and assuming that people in rural and urban areas have the same interpretation of that phrase. And then I talk a lot about food insecurity and food poverty as well. And so often food poverty is seen as an urban issue. And I was astounded in the research for the book to uncover how much it is just a problem in rural areas as well. And I talk about the UK and the US. And, that, and the food desert of the countryside where you're surrounded by food and you can't buy it anywhere, particularly fresh produce. And that food is something where there are urban rural divides running through it. And what I try and do in the book is unpack it a little bit and try and separate these forces of food and farming and kind of look at them, a bit more word is kind of on their own, and then try and see how they intersect with each other.
Yeah. And then there's the environment chapter, and I thought this was particularly fascinating as well. I'm interested in your view, and again, you've both for this book and for numerous other things as well. You've interviewed people on both sides. Where do you think? And I say actually both sides there. That's a mistake, Ben. Don't say sides. Don't bring that in. But where do you think conservation sits at the moment? And I'm also we've got the words conservation, we've got the words rewilding, which again there's all just an ongoing debate on what we mean by all this still. But where do you think conservation sits on that urban rural question? Who does it belong to?
Yeah, it's really good. And I spent lots of time pondering this. So on the surface, the environment conservation question is not an urban rural issue. It's that decades-long conflict between agriculture and conservation.
Yeah.
But the urban rural thing is there, and you don't have to just, if you scratch the surface, it's there. And if you look at the climate action movement, Extinction Rebellion, if you look at vegan activism, these are inherently urban movements. With the nucleus is in the cities, and farming still predominantly land-based, rural, employs a lot of rural people. So at its heart, but on the kind of like more activist level, these are different cultures with different life experiences, different politics. But when those two worlds come together, all of that again kind of melts away. So I use my sister as an example. So my sister is a conservationist and a very ecologically educated person. And she's worked for the National Trust as a ranger. She's worked for the wildlife trusts on natural flood management. She's now working for Bug Life as a conservation officer, doing lots on pollinator highways and linking up habitat to create networks for pollinators around Shropshire. And she's also a farmer's daughter with exactly the same upbringing as mine, and comes from a farming community. And her experiences, and when you talk to her about her work with farmers, it is so far away from the debates that we read about in the news, and that conservationists and farmers are just at each other's throats and it's this big old battle. When you talk to people that are kind of living both worlds, and there's a lot of conservationists that come from farming backgrounds or come from rural communities and are still in those rural communities, and they're working for National Trust or whatever. I mean, yourself. And you kind of think actually there's a subtlety to this relationship that we're missing in the national debate about agriculture and conservation, and we're kind of missing where the two just cross over so much. Because Kate isn't unique. There'll be a lot of farmers' daughters that are ecologists. So And I don't think necessarily the national conversation, which tends to always drag these things into a binary black or white debate, leans enough on those people, you know. And the amount of conservationists that go into farming, like I know a lot of people, first generation farmers that come from ecological backgrounds,
yep,
that are farming. And there is so much crossover, but that crossover on the ground doesn't always translate to crossover in the debates at a macro level.
Yeah. Were there any particular aspects of the book that were difficult to write?
All of it.
Can you round that down?
I'm a very conflict averse person that's written a book about conflict.
Yeah, exactly.
I hate having a row. I am not good at conflict. But I think probably the diversity chapter was the hardest to write because, you know, I'm a white, heterosexual, cisgender British woman writing about diversity. That was difficult. And, you know, so it's so important, you know, it's about the people's stories and people with different experiences to me that I could go to and ask questions. And I'm so grateful to all of the people that feature in that chapter for their openness and for allowing me to ask difficult questions about really sensitive subjects, because, you know, it is uncomfortable to talk about diversity, particularly for white people. White people are very uncomfortable talking about racism and talking about diversity. And, you know, the people that I've spoken to in the book have helped me overcome some of that discomfort. But I was also very aware that I have a truth as well, coming from a rural community. You know, my community deserves a voice on these issues as well. So, you know, I put that voice forward as well. So, but yeah, that probably the diversity chapter, I think, took me the longest time to write, because I wanted to be, well, you're just very aware of your white privilege, aren't you?
Yep. Adam Hedson has called the book a brilliant call to action for town and country to work together like never before. What does working together really mean for you, do you reckon?
Acknowledging difference. And once you acknowledge it, accepting it with empathy and compassion, and then listening to each other. And then you can work together. So it's kind of before the kind of like actual work can happen, it's kind of like a process. And, you know, and working together, that could be like the really big stuff. So, you know, we've seen Keir Starmer saying that he's going after Boris's blue wall in the same way that Boris went after Labour's red wall.
Yep.
I find that really fascinating, and I'm really looking forward to watch how that plays out, because it's fresh and it's new, and it's like, oh, you know, Labour aren't just overlooking the blue rural areas.
Yeah.
That will be a really interesting process to watch. You know, the NFU engaging with urban schools, making a real effort to get into, you know, inner city areas, dog walkers talking to landowners, landowners talking to dog walkers. You know, all these things are working together, but none of it is, in my opinion, it won't get very far unless we go through a conscious acknowledgement that you are probably going to see the world very differently if you were brought up in an urban area to somebody that was brought up in a rural area. And it sounds so blinking obvious. The whole time I was writing this book, my main insecurity is no one. Oh God, this is just so bleeding obvious. Everyone knows this, but yes, we know it. And I think because it is so kind of obvious, it's hiding in plain sight as a problem.
Yeah.
Because you're like, well, yeah, we know the city and the countryside is different, but we don't ever examine why. What problems could it be causing when we don't fully understand why? So yeah, and you know, acknowledging the differences is the first step to working together constructively.
Yeah. I mean, and do you reckon there are, for people who actually read the book, are there any, it's not calls to action necessarily, because that's the wrong way of putting it, but, and obviously people will come to their own conclusions at the end, but how would you like, in an ideal world, people to be feeling at the end of reading the book?
I'd like people to go, oh, I never really thought of it like that.
Yeah.
That's the kind of
Okay.
reaction I'm looking for is, oh yeah, never really thought of it like that before. Which is pretty much the reaction I had to every single interview I did in the book. Is people giving you their opinions, and you just go, oh yeah. And I think, yeah, there is a message for the public, and I think, you know, particularly if you're an urban person, because the thing that I found about the urban rural disconnect is that it is felt very palpably and very emotionally by rural people,
Yeah.
but not so much by urban people.
Absolutely.
And I think even if you are urban, it's very easy to overlook it and maybe even think it's not important and to even scoff at it. But I think that's a great danger to overlook it, because, you know, if we look at farmers, you know, they're managing 70% of our landscape. You know, 70%, you know, and it's in the urban world where our government departments are based, where the head offices of our conservation organizations are based, where our media resides. All of this is in big cities. And these are the people that have big opinions and big ambitions for the countryside, and they really want to change it. Now, if they want to make change in the countryside, they've first got to understand the people that live there, you know, their communities, their families, their rural business networks, their way of life, their politics, their worldview. You've got to do all of that first if you then want to go and work with them constructively on the things that you want to change or shape. So that would be my message for the urban reader.
And finally, a message for farmers. What is your message for farmers?
My message to farmers is more than 80% of British people live in towns and cities, and you need them as much as they need you. And for too long, for my entire lifetime, and probably long before I was born, too many farmers have moaned and whinged that they don't understand us, they don't know where their food comes from, they don't have a clue about farming, they don't respect the countryside, you know, all of this. And it's like, well, actually, I want to call that out now and say, well, how much are you trying to understand them? You know, do you ever go to a city? Do you ever spend your free time in a city? You know, a lot of farmers I speak to take some kind of weird pride in the fact that they've never been to a city. I never go to the city, never been to London, never been to London, no interest in it.
Yeah. And
I've never spent a night away from the farm. My cousin has never been on a train.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's wrong. You know, you can't moan about a way of life you've never even attempted to understand yourself.
Yeah.
So my message to farmers is, go to a city, go on a mini break to the city, eat in a vegan restaurant, go to a city centre cinema or a museum or an art gallery, go to an Extinction Rebellion protest and watch and talk to people. Get out of your rural comfort zone and step towards the urban world, rather than treating it like some kind of alien culture that is threatening your way of life in the countryside. And, you know, and that might sound a bit harsh, but I know that there are those views out there. And, you know, an expectation on the urban consumer to get educated about farming. We need to educate them about where their food is produced. And it's like, well, educate yourself about what it's like to live in a block of flats in the middle of Hackney. That's my message to farmers.
Brilliant. That's a great challenge to listeners, I'm sure. Anna, thank you so much for coming on the show. Honestly, it's been a real pleasure. I know that we could have been talking about this for so long. We also didn't slide in the reference to Will Evans being a macho farmer or not.
Oh, I know. I have an answer for his question if you want me to.
Oh, do you? Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's go for that.
Have we got time to fit it in?
Yeah, let's put that in. So we do have one question, and that's from Mr. Will Evans. Why are many farmers seemingly obsessed with vegans when they represent such a small proportion of the UK population? And is it detrimental to us as an industry by making us seem desperately insecure about what we do? I think it's a really good question.
Yeah, that's the banging question. Yeah, happy to take that. And first thing I'd say is I understand it. I understand that obsession because I've experienced it myself when I was about 9 or 10. And when I was in primary school, a vegetarian came to the school, and her family had moved down from Manchester. And I remember the arguments we had about meat eating in the school hall over our lunchboxes. And I was I remember the feeling of threat, and I remember like, I need to win this argument. I need to make her see why we should eat animals and why, it's okay to produce animals and kill them for meat. And I remember that, and I remember feeling like it became like an obsession.
Yeah.
And the reason it became an obsession for me was because it felt like a threat, and it came from insecurity. Just as Will said, it was absolute insecurity. It was somebody had come into our community that thought what we did for a living was wrong, and that made me feel like there was something wrong with me. And if you feel like there's something wrong with you, then you're going to fight to defend. And but I learned an important lesson as a little girl talking to a vegetarian, and that was to get over the threat, to accept that people think differently. What they choose to put in their mouths is their business, not your business. And you can accept it. So I do understand, because I have felt that anger in my belly, and I have felt that need to defend my way of life and what my family do and what my family have done for generations. And but Will is right. When it becomes an obsession, it does give off not a nice image of our industry, and it can come across as very insecure and aggressive. And I'm sure that's how I came off, when I was 9 years old. I'm sure I did, because I remember being very angry. So we have got to get a grip of it. And because it can get a bit ridiculous. A couple of years ago, I remember there was a headline in the Farmer's Guardian, and I pulled it out, and the headline was, "Farmers must galvanize against organized vegans." I was like, what? Really? We're getting into this kind of language?
Yeah.
So I think what we need to remember is that vegans have a lot in common with farmers. Together, they make up like 2% of the UK population.
Yep.
They both like animals. They both care a lot about the issues much of the rest of the population doesn't give two hoots about.
Yep.
So they are actually very, very united and very, very informed, and care about the same things. So if we start to see what we have in common with vegans rather than what sets us apart, we might get over the obsession.
That's a really interesting point, and another challenge for our listeners. We're going to leave it there, but Anna, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure. And please, listeners, do buy the book. It's called Divide: The Relationship Crisis Between Town and Country. It's out on March the 3rd. Read it and enjoy it. And I'm sure that Anna would love to hear any feedback you have as well.
I would, definitely. Thank you so much for having me. This has been such an interesting chat.
Oh, thanks, Anna. I will see you next time when we'll have a brand new guest with you. But I will have a great week in the meantime. And I will see you next time.
I had a little bit of a go like 18 months ago.
Not your cup of tea.
Little sprayer. He loved it. Absolutely.
I was going to say, spray. Yes, sprayer drivers love it.
Yeah.
I think everyone else is like, what?
Yeah, I think it's his favourite place to be.